Hello to my friends, family, and audience in India, America, and abroad. This is Sunny Sharma back with his podcast, India Inside with Sunny Sharma, and YouTube channel, Sunny Sharma at India Inside Movement. Today is the 250th anniversary of American independence, the formation of the first constitutional republic in the world. Um, and I wanted to discuss a general framework on the importance of building a political party which is the only tangible and legitimate political party that can reform the country, which is a political party which reforms our broken electoral system. Um, so, so I want to explain generally what are those laws which we must reform. This is an idea I generated through which I canvassed through the Democratic Socialists of America Political Education Committee, and these are just a series of about 11 recommendations or laws that need to be reformed in this country in order to level the playing field for a new political party. As many people may know, if they have studied American history, it has always been new third political parties, which have fundamentally transformed politics in America. This has generally been the case, not always, but this has tended to be the case that new political parties have always provided a new discourse on new laws and new ways of thinking. And these new ways of thinking have developed new policy platforms, which have generally led to new forms of governance and new ideas in governance. And so this is what I've written. This is what I call 10 years too late. We must build a political party which must reform our broken electoral system laws. This is by me, Sunny Sharma. So this is in order of priority, in my opinion. What I feel number one, from priority from first being the most important to reform to 11 being the least important to reform, but also important. So number one, we must eliminate gerrymandering. So just to discuss a little, this all started a year back, or even 6 months ago, with Texas, with the state of Texas in their redistricting framework, in which Texas drew congressional maps to favor Republicans, and this resulted in California doing the same thing. And this also resulted in many other Republican states reforming their districts after the 2026 Louisiana v. Calais decision of April 29th. This happened during early voting in many states, and this resulted in around 4 Republican states, maybe more, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, etc., redrawing their congressional maps. Surprisingly, Georgia, the state in which I live in, which has probably the greatest history of voting discrimination against a primarily strong Black community, a Black community that was very strong in many eras of Georgia history, Georgia decided not to redistrict, and this went against the Republican authorities. Not all their authorities, but the Republican legislature decided against the recommendations of the Republican governor to redistrict. And this was probably a tactical decision because they didn't want to probably incite a greater Democratic response, which has primarily been driven by Senate races, such as the very expensive Senate race happening this year of Senator John Ossoff, and many other races happening in Georgia. So eliminating gerrymandering will be very important, because what gerrymandering essentially does is that it imposes limitations on complex historical boundaries that go against the historical setup, the historical, how do I say, configuration of those boundaries, which have always been maintained to preserve the community boundaries and culture of those communities, and that has primarily been used against Black communities, especially in the South of the United States, which has the greatest history of voting discrimination. Number two, we have to rehabilitate the original provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And this means passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to accommodate this decision, specifically rehabilitating Section 5 pre-clearance of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So pre-clearance made it so that especially southern states with histories of voting discrimination have to get permission from the Department of Justice or the federal government before changing their voting laws. And this makes sure that voting laws don't get changed to disadvantage minority communities, primarily Black communities. And this also goes hand in hand with rehabilitating Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which concerns majority minority districts in something called voting dilution, which is diluting majority minority districts, which are primarily Black districts, as we know. Number 3, we have to implement ranked choice voting with instant runoffs, which is instant runoffs are voting is a single winner ranked voting election system where one or more eliminations are used to simulate multiple runoff elections. So ranked choice voting makes sure that candidates who may not be as popular but have very good public policy platforms get bigger prioritization by the majority electoral constituency. So this allows for fair voting. This allows for a fair electoral process whereby candidates who have better governing policies get projected to be the winners in election outcomes. It's more complicated than that, but I'll explain in future videos. Number 4, this is probably the most debated of all of the decisions, but I believe it is necessary from many of the people who I've discussed this with. There has to be an abolition of the Electoral College. We have to abolish the Electoral College. And there is some disagreement about this. Some people think that the Electoral College allows there to be representation for the majority of Republican states. That is a good argument that Republican states get better representation. But if you look at the history of the Electoral College and what it has done, it has elected candidates who have not won the majority popular vote in America in many cases, especially in the 21st century. This happened at the turn of the 21st century. It happened with Donald Trump. With the election of Donald Trump is probably the most well-known case, and this case has made it so that many people have stood in stark opposition to the Electoral College. This can be debated further, but I personally feel, given the history of what has happened, I think there has to be an abolition of the Electoral College. Number 5, there has to be a repeal of the 2010 United States decision. This essentially made it so that super PACs could have unlimited. There could be the formation of super PACs, which can donate, which their donations are used as free speech. So when their donations are defined as free speech, this allows them to give unlimited donations as much as they want, and as some politicians have said, it allows them to sell or buy elections to the highest bidder. So this allows for a very unfair electoral process, and it gives power to the corporations. If you still believe in capitalism, you must understand that there is a problem with corporatism rather than capitalism. And because there's a problem with corporatism, it allows for corporations to gain unfair advantages in our electoral process, politically, economically, and ultimately, it helps them to define the culture of our country. Number 6, we have to mandate a shorter election funding cycle so politicians can focus on governance rather than campaigning. So essentially, there has to be public funding of elections. This will make it so that private entities don't, like the Citizens United decision, private entities don't gain unneeded influence and can use their own self-interest to undermine the collective interest of the people who want to form a better politic. And whether we form that better politic is up to a lot of debate, but we need a shorter election funding cycle because politicians need to focus on governance. They should not have to focus on campaigning all the time. Number 7, we have to reform the public education system through political education to do 2 things. There has to be civic engagement, especially in local communities. So people have to be involved in local community decision making, even though this is very difficult. people have to be able to make the decisions, not the make the decisions in line with their representatives. They have to work in conjunction with their representatives. This is very difficult to achieve, but in an idealistic world, we want there to be a degree of civic engagement with our political representatives. Number two, there has to be political education on building an anti-tyranny culture, especially in national politics. So essentially, like in every era of history, I'm not saying we lack this in America. I do think we have many great academics and organizers and teachers who teach a very good history of America and who teach a very good history, which in the end hopefully will mean that we undermine the tyranny that rises up in every generation, which is happening. But it needs to be maintained in every era, and this is primarily done through education. I primarily remember an excerpt from a book on Eugene Debs, where the superintendent of where Eugene Debs was raised, where he was educated, said, "If we don't maintain an anti-tyranny culture, then demagogues and politicians will create a culture which goes against the interests of the average person." Number eight, we have to ban voting laws in local jurisdictions that make it harder for people to vote, including banning, number one, voter ID laws, B, the sudden and unnecessary closing of polling places, and C, this one is a little, this is a little more historical, the institution of black codes. So black codes essentially have been laws that historically have made it harder for minorities to vote in the country, and this has primarily happened in the South of America, in the southern United States. And this involves a whole degree of laws, polling, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all these tests that are not happening immediately as we see them tangibly. They're not happening visually. But many people, especially conservatives, want to bring us back to a time when these codes were in place, and they want to probably erase the history saying that these codes were never in place before. They want to rewrite our history to an extent that that there are limitations on minority voting power in this country, especially that of the African American constituency. Number nine, we're almost done here. We have to create a multi-party system in America that does three things. A, gets rid of the requirement for signed petitions to get on the ballot. There must be an easier way for new party candidates to get on the ballot. There cannot be this unnecessary signing of petitions by thousands of people. Even though that does demonstrate that there is support for party platforms, it makes it much harder for people who have new ideas and who have less money and who are working class candidates to win against longtime incumbents who, some incumbents do a good job, but many incumbents are very lacking in their ability and also are getting very old. Number two, B, allow for third and new parties that are not a part of the mainstream to get on TV and the debate stage. So essentially, this goes in conjunction with the first point. We need to make it easier for candidates to present their public policy platforms. And this falls in line with the third point, allow for new candidates the equal opportunity to propose their value system when running for office. So we need candidates to be able to debate their ideas in the arena of ideas, in the marketplace of ideas, as President Obama talks about. We need an equal opportunity for all candidates to present their public policy platforms and to whether they're good ideas or bad ideas, they need the opportunity to sell the case of whether they should be politicians in this country. And ultimately, unfortunately, yes, very self-interested people get into power. But if we do reform local politics enough, if we create a culture where new parties attract enough people who really want to reform the system, we can both create a local culture that is very conducive to change, as well as a national culture, which will hopefully elect someone who will be as inspirational as some of our most inspirational leaders have been in the past. Number 10, we have to encourage voting accessibility that has been advanced over several decades. So over several decades, voting laws have changed drastically in expansion to accommodating new people, accommodating the disabled, overseas soldiers, veterans, and the unhoused. And this has been done through mail-in voting, because if for people who can't get to the polls, there should be still an ability for people to vote in a way that makes it. There has to be an easier way for people to vote. It shouldn't be so difficult that it should be both easy and it should be a safe voting process, so that the voting process is not delegitimized or is re-engineered in a way so that there is voting fraud, which is a valid case by the right. But voting has to be accessible for all people, and this has been done over several decades since the 1965 Voting Rights Act through several laws. And now for the last point. There has to be a consistent and vigorous effort to reinterpret language from judicial precedent through one. I think there has to be an application of term limits to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, as many people have discussed with me, has been really a tool by one or other of the parties. Primarily has been a tool of the right so far to pass sweeping cultural reforms, not just political reforms, but reforms that affect the cultural landscape of America. And they've been very unfair in how they have swayed power in favor of the right. And then number two, we have to examine what phrases like intentional discrimination and unconstitutional racial gerrymandering mean, and who does it apply to and under what circumstances. So these phrases, such as quote unquote intentional discrimination and quote unquote unconstitutional racial gerrymandering, have been reinterpreted by the Supreme Court to be used against minority voting power. So we have to find a way in order to make laws that are provide equal opportunity, equity and equality, so that there's equal opportunity for all people to vote, so that everyone's vote matters equally. And this is very difficult because ultimately the voting process is not equal. Like many people have recommended that if one side gerrymanders, then the other side should gerrymander as aggressively. Ultimately, there is going to be a battle for votes, and ultimately, it is not always a fair process, and it's not always equal. But we have to have hope in America that people will strive for better political outcomes, and a part of creating these better political outcomes involves creating a fair electoral process. So to create a fair electoral process, any major new party that comes should prioritize, especially for reforming the electoral system and reforming these electoral laws. So I thank you for listening for my podcast, and I'll be back with future videos on American history, politics, and/or Indian history and politics. Thank you.